Hello, my name is Nicole Neville and welcome to the webinar on the legislation and how it can help you to pass your CTA and ATT exams. You can see on the left-hand side of the screen some of the questions and comments that I've heard from students about using the legislation. Very often I hear there are so many volumes. It's just so daunting just looking at the number of volumes of legislation. How will I ever find anything? I don't know where to start. So I'm going to address that with you in this webinar, and hopefully that will put your mind at rest as to how to navigate your way around the legislation. I often get asked, do I really need the legislation for the exams? Particularly now, as we know that the exams in May 2021 are open book exams. So we'll have a little talk about that. And then very often I get asked, please give me some tips as to how to mark up my legislation. What's the best way of highlighting things? What's the best way of tagging the pages? So I'm going to go through that with you, and hopefully some other things that will help you and put your mind at rest about how the legislation can really help you to pass your exams. Okay, so firstly, for the 2021 exams, the legislation that you should be using is the Tolley's Yellow Tax Handbooks, the 2021 edition, and if relevant to the exams that you're taking, the Orange Tax Handbooks, also the 2021 edition. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the exams in May 2021 are open book. That means you can take any material into the exam with you, or have that material open alongside you as you are attempting the exam. And that would include the legislation as well. What that also means, though, is that you can annotate, highlight, tag your legislation as you like. You can scribble anything into the margins to help you out. But please be careful. We have not yet got confirmation from either the ATT or the CTA as to whether or not the exams in November 2021 are also going to be open book. It might well be the case that they're not open book in November 2021, in which case you will be allowed to use your legislation, but the rules will be stricter as to how you can highlight and annotate and tag it. So if there is a chance that you're going to be using the same set of legislation in the May exams and in the November exams, I strongly recommend that you are very careful about how you look after your legislation. So for the November 2021 exams, given that they are not, or they might not be open book, what can you do with your legislation? Well, you can, as you can see I've done on this slide, underline words in the legislation. You can sideline pages of the legislation. You can tag the legislation, and I've put in there a picture of index flags that you can use. You can fold pages as a way of bookmarking things, and you can highlight the legislation. But notice, any annotation within the permitted books, except for the name of the owner, is prohibited. So be really careful with your legislation. I would suggest not writing anything in it, because even though that's okay for the May 2021 exams, it might not be for the November 21 exams. Also, though you can use the index flags to bookmark pages, again, be really careful. If the exam is not open book in November 2021, then you will not be allowed to have index flags which have got writing on them. Nor will you be allowed to use post-it notes. So post-it notes are not allowed, index. So let's answer the first question that I've put up on the left-hand side of the screen. There's so many volumes, how am I ever going to find anything? So what we're going to have a look at is what is in each volume, how you're going to find things in those volumes, so how useful the contents pages are, and also we're going to have a look at whether or not it's worth using the index. So let's start by having a look at the contents of the various different books. Now, the main taxes that you're likely to need to refer to in the legislation are income tax, corporation tax, and capital gains tax. The primary legislation, that's the law that goes through the Houses of Parliament to get royal assent, is contained in parts 1A, 1B and 1C. The secondary legislation, which is another type of legislation, is contained within part 2 for income tax, corporation tax and capital gains tax. For the other taxes, the ones that are likely to be more peripheral to your syllabuses, the primary and the secondary legislation are all contained in the same volume. So for inheritance tax and national insurance contributions, you'll be looking at part 3 of the yellow books. For VAT, you've got the primary and secondary legislation in part 1 of the orange books. And for stamp taxes, again, the primary and secondary legislation is all contained in part 2 of the orange book. I've put in there a little list there of what the secondary legislation includes. Things like statutory instruments, statements of practices, extra statutory concessions and codes of practice. We'll look at that in a bit more detail later on. But what's particularly nice about the secondary legislation is it tends to be written in easier to understand language. So it's just a little bit more user friendly. Okay, let's have a look in a bit more detail at what is in the primary legislation for income tax, corporation tax and capital gains tax. So we're looking specifically now at parts 1A, 1B and 1C of the yellow books. Now, parts 1A to 1C are in chronological order, starting with the earliest acts, going all the way through to Finance Act 2020, which is at the end of part 1C. If I just grab a copy of my legislation here, if you can see there's some grey shading along the side of the books. Those grey shadings show you the key statutes that you're going to need for the exam. Those are the consolidation acts, and we're going to talk through those various different acts. In between the grey shading, then you've got finance acts and other minor statutes which haven't been consolidated into the main acts. And those are the areas that you're less likely to need to refer to for your exam. So let's focus on those consolidation acts, those main acts that you're likely to need for the exam that are included within the primary legislation. So looking at the left of your screen, you can see in volume 1A, you've got the Capital Gains Act, TCGA 1992, and that includes all the rules on capital gains tax for individuals as well as capital gains for companies. So if, for example, you want to look up the conditions for a particular capital gains tax relief, that's where you're going to go. Also within Part 1A, you've got the Capital Allowances Act. CAA stands for Capital Allowances Act, and that was consolidated in 2001. And that gives you all the rules on capital allowances for both unincorporated and incorporated businesses. Now, when it comes to income tax, there are 3 main acts that are going to help you for the exam. The question is, with these 3 main acts, how are you going to know what's included in each one? And this is where the income tax computation pro forma is going to be incredibly helpful. So what I've put up here on the screen is an income tax computation pro forma laid out in a way hopefully that you're familiar with. I've started off with the employment income. Now, if you want to look up in the legislation anything to do with employment income, you will look into Teopa 2003, and that's included in Part 1A of the legislation. ITEPA stands for Income Tax, Earnings and Pension Act. So anything to do with earnings, anything to do with employment income is within ITEPA. So if you want to look up the rules on taxable benefits or exempt benefits, you'll find that in ITEPA. The rules on termination payments, again, in ITEPA. Share schemes, in ITEPA. Next in the income tax computation, you've got the various different other sources of income that an individual might have. Trading income, property income, interest and dividend income. If you want to look up the rules on any of those, then you want to look into ITOIA. That was consolidated in 2005, and that's going to be in Part 1B of the legislation. ITOIA stands for Income Tax, Trading and Other Income Act, and it covers exactly that. It covers all the rules on trading income and other income. So the rules on adjustments to profits, the rules on basis periods for sole traders, for partnerships, are all within ITOIA, as is the rules on property income. Then finally, the last act that's going to be relevant to you for income tax is ITA, Income Taxes Act 2007. And that covers off everything else. So everything that doesn't specifically relate to a source of income, but is relevant to income tax. So things like deductible payments and what they are, personal allowance and whether or not that perhaps needs to be tapered for high income individuals. All those rules are covered in ITA, Income Taxes Act 2007, and that's in Part 1B. So going on to the rest of our income tax computation pro forma, when it comes to the rules on extending bands, when it comes to the rules on tax reducers, that's all covered off in Income Taxes Act 2007. So, by way of a recap of what we've seen so far, and this is on the right-hand side of your screen, the three main acts for income tax: ITEPA, Income Tax, Earnings and Pensions Act, covers off everything you need to know about employment income. ITOIA, Income Tax, Trading and Other Income Act, covers off all the things that you need to know about the other different sources of income that an individual might have. And then ITA, Income Taxes Act, just covers off anything that doesn't specifically relate to a particular source of income. We're going to take a very similar approach now when we look at the acts that cover off things for corporation tax purposes. So let's have a look at our corporation tax computation. So here's the pro forma. And there are two main acts that you want to be familiar with here, starting with CTA 2009. And that's in volume 1B. That includes all the rules on the various different sources of income for a company. So if you want to look up any rules to do with trading income for a company, that's all within CTA 2009. So, for example, the R&D rules are in CTA 2009. Loan relationship rules are also included in CTA 2009. IFA rules, again, all within CTA 2009. So that looks at all the various different sources of income for a company and how they're taxed. CTA 2010 covers everything else. So everything that doesn't specifically relate to a source of income. So CTA 2010 will cover off things like losses and how relief is available to them, close companies and the rules on those, purchase of own shares, all covered in CTA 2010, which is in Part C of the legislation. Now, I have also included on the list down the left-hand side one other act, Teopa 2010. That's a Corporation Tax Act. That's at the back of Part 1B. Teopa stands for Taxation of International and Other Provisions. Now, that Act is probably only going to be relevant to you if you are doing the advanced technical paper for taxation of major corporates. That's got all the international rules, for example, CFCs and transfer pricing. So what I've got up on the screen here is hopefully a useful summary table of the main acts for income tax, capital gains tax and corporation tax, and where you're going to find them in the legislation, and we've just talked through how you're going to know what's included in each of them. Okay, so we've hopefully answered, or come some way to answering, the first question on the right-hand side of the screen. There are so many volumes, how will I ever find anything? We've looked specifically at the primary legislation and what's included in parts 1A, 1B and 1C. We'll come to the other bits of legislation soon. My next question is, do I really need the legislation for the exam? Within the legislation, you have got detailed definitions, detailed rules for all the things that you might be examined on. The legislation will give you all the detail that you might need. It will give you all the sort of fiddly bits that you might get tested on in the exams. When it comes to conditions, you will have not just an exhaustive list of conditions, but a comprehensive list of conditions. So you can be rest assured that if it's not in the legislation, you don't have to worry about it. So the legislation can be extremely useful, and the examiner might well set questions, particularly at CTA, where you really can only get those extra marks by using your legislation, because that's the only place that will have that level of detail that is required. So, given that the legislation might be the only place that has the answer, let's have a look at my third question. Please give me some tips as to how to mark up my legislation. And bearing in mind that we want to make sure our legislation is going to be helpful to us in November 2021, if the exams are not open book, the tips that I'm going to give you are to make sure that we're not doing any annotations within the legislation or any annotations on any index flags that we use. So what I'm going to start by looking at with you is how we can highlight the contents pages, and that often on its own can be enough to help us. So that's our starting point. Let's think about highlighting the contents pages. So have a look on the left-hand side of the screen. This could be a part of a question. You could be told Susan is provided with the following benefits from her employer: company car, an annual medical checkup, an annual eye test. And she'd like some advice as to how she will be taxed on those benefits. Now, when it comes to the company car benefit, hopefully you feel reasonably confident on this, and you can tell her that you need to know the list price, you need to know the carbon dioxide emissions of the car, and then you can establish what the taxable benefit is. When it comes to the annual medical checkup and the annual eye test, you might be thinking, not too sure about this. Perhaps either or both of those are exempt benefits. So what you might want to do to prepare yourself for that in the exam is go into ITEPA, because remember ITEPA deals with everything to do with employment income, and have highlighted in the contents page the key list of exempt benefits that an employee might be provided with. So here's an extract of the contents page, and what you can see here is section 320A looks at eye tests. That is an exempt benefit. And that on its own might be enough. If you need a bit more detail, you know where to find it within section 320A. And what that will tell you is those eye tests will be an exempt benefit if the employee is required to use a VDU as part of their employment. Section 320B covers off health screening and medical checkups. So there you go, that medical checkup is an exempt benefit. So having highlighted in advance of the exams the key exempt benefits, in the contents page, what you have prepared for yourself is a comprehensive and exhaustive list of all the exempt benefits that an employee might be provided with, and that should give you absolute confidence in the exam that you can spot which benefits are exempt, and if you need a bit more detail as to the conditions that need to be met, you'll know where to find it. You'll just turn to those relevant sections of the legislation. So, highlighting the contents page on its own is extremely useful. But sometimes you might need even more than just that. Sometimes you might need to go into the various different sections and highlight the conditions as well. So, new example here. We've got Rose. She's just set up a company which owns and operates boutique hotels. She wants to know whether her friend can claim EIS relief, Enterprise Investment Scheme relief, if she subscribes for shares in this company. So hopefully you're aware that if somebody subscribes for shares in an EIS company, then subject to various conditions being met, that individual will be able to claim an income tax reducer. But there are lots of conditions that need to be met for relief to be available. We've got to have a qualifying investor, so her friend has to meet various conditions. The shares have to meet various conditions as well, as does the company. So this company which owns and operates boutique hotels. So let's see how the legislation can help us. Now, let's think about what we're looking at here. We're looking at the rules on income tax reducers. So that doesn't specifically relate to employment income, so it won't be an ITPA. It doesn't specifically relate to any other source of income, so it won't be an ITOIA. So we should be looking in Income Taxes Act. And indeed, if we look at Part 5 of the Income Taxes Act, we've got all the rules there about enterprise investment schemes. And what we're going to focus on is Chapter 4, the issuing company. We want to know whether Rose's company will be a qualifying company. So let's have a look at the detail within the contents page of Chapter 4. So we're told here in Section 180A that there is a UK permanent establishment requirement. So we need to check, is this company, or does this company have a permanent establishment within the UK? Section 181 is about the trading requirement. Well, it does look likely that this company is a trading company because we know it owns and operates boutique hotels. But it's got to have a qualifying business activity. So we'll need to check if operating boutique hotels is a qualifying business activity. The company must be unquoted, and it's got to be of a particular size that it doesn't breach the gross assets requirement or the number of employees requirement. So there's lots of extra information that we're going to need to ask from Rose. But for now, let's just have a look at whether or not her company is carrying on a qualifying business activity. So let's have a look at Section 183. So without reading through all the detail in Section 183, what that is telling us is that the company must be carrying on a relevant qualifying trade. That doesn't actually tell us whether or not the trade that she is carrying on through her company is a relevant qualifying trade. So let's dig a little bit deeper. If we go into Section 189, that's headed up meaning of a qualifying trade. What does that tell us? That tells us that it can't be carrying on any excluded activities. But that still doesn't tell us what is a qualifying trade or indeed what is an excluded activity, so we can rule that out. So we've got to go a little bit deeper. Here we go, finally. We get to Section 192 and that gives us a full long list of excluded activities. So this is your comprehensive, exhaustive list that you're not going to want to memorize, but you're going to want to flag it up with your index flag so that you can find it if relevant in the exam. So what is an excluded activity? Anything banking or insurance related, legal or accountancy services, anything heavily asset backed like property development, farming or market gardening are excluded activities. And that does indeed include, let's highlight it in a different colour, operating or managing hotels. So once we've spotted that, we can get back to Rose in the exam context and say to her, her friend won't be able to claim EIS relief because this company is carrying on an excluded activity. And obviously, if you've prepared your legislation in advance, you've got the contents pages highlighted, you've got index flags in to help you bookmark certain sections, then you'll be able to refer to this section 192 quickly and easily. Just check what is the activity of her company to be able to rule out or otherwise whether or not there is an excluded activity. Just whilst we're talking about EIS companies, we saw that there was a section covering the gross assets requirement. That's section 186. In terms of highlighting this detail in the section, you just want to be really careful. Just highlight the bare minimum. To meet the gross assets requirement, the gross assets of the company must not exceed £15 million before the share issue, and then highlight again, not exceed £16 million afterwards. And just by highlighting just the key words and key numbers, that should be enough to remind you if it's relevant in the exam. So, highlighting the contents pages is a good starting point, but then sometimes we do need to go into the various different sections and highlight some detail in there. Now let's talk about how we can highlight as a signpost. So, let's have a different example. Here we've got Daniel. He's just bought some office space and wants to know whether the following items will qualify for capital allowances. So he's going to put up some partition walls, he's going to put in a shaft to install an escalator, he's then going to put the escalator in, some stairs and a painting to hang in the reception area. So let's see how the legislation can help us. So we're going to look into Capital Allowances Act, and at the beginning of the Act, in sections 21, 22 and 23, we've got some very useful sections which help us out with the definition of plant. So section 21 talks about what is a building and therefore not plant, so therefore capital allowances are not available. Section 22 gives us a list of what's considered structures. Again, these are not plant and therefore no capital allowances are available. Section 23, though, gives us a list of items that look like they may be part of a building or a structure, but are indeed plant, and therefore capital allowances are available. So hopefully what you're seeing here is I've used two different colours here. Red, the stop. If the item you're looking for is part of a building or part of a structure, not treated as plant or machinery, and therefore no capital allowances are available. Whereas green is for go, section 23, that's got our list there of what is plant and machinery, and therefore capital allowances are available. So using different coloured highlighters or different coloured pens to underline things can help you out as to when capital allowances in this case are available or not. So just looking down my list in my question on the left, walls, escalators, stairs, to me, at first sight, they all look like they're part of a building and therefore we'll check, but it looks like they might be covered within section 21 and so no capital allowances will be available. When it comes to that painting, I'm thinking, is that even plant or machinery anyway? So I don't think that's going to qualify for capital allowances either. So my first reaction is that none of those items will qualify, but I'm going to use the legislation to help me so I can be reassured or otherwise that my gut feeling is correct. So let's start by having a look at section 21. So section 21, remember, covers off what is part of a building and therefore does not qualify for capital allowances. So we've got here list A, which includes assets that are treated as part of a building. So walls are treated as part of a building and do not qualify for capital allowances. Same treatment for stairs. So it looks like my gut feeling on that was correct. Looking at item number 5, shafts or other structures in which lifts, hoists or escalators are installed, again, are part of the building and therefore do not qualify for capital allowances. So here I've got some reassurance that the walls, the shaft for the escalator and the stairs are part of the building and therefore do not qualify for capital allowances. Let's keep going though. Section 23 here, remember, is the section which tells us about expenditure unaffected by sections 21 and 22. So items that might look like they're part of a building or part of a structure, but actually capital allowances are available. So this is the bit we're highlighting or underlining in green. So section 33A we're referred to here talks about integral features. These are features integral to the building, but they do indeed qualify for capital allowances, albeit at the special rates. So if you look into section 33A, you will see that includes things like air conditioning units, it includes things like escalators and lifts. So though the shaft to install the escalator is included within section 21 and is therefore part of a building and does not qualify for capital allowances, the escalator itself is included within section 33A, and we're told here that because that's an integral feature, it will qualify for capital allowances. And if we move further on within section 23, we've got list C here, which is an incredibly useful list of items of expenditure which do indeed qualify for capital allowances. So I've already highlighted quite a few items in green there for you. Let me draw your attention to item number 13, partition walls. Ooh, now this is a bit worrying. We saw in section 21 that walls are part of a building and therefore don't qualify for capital allowances. But now we're seeing in section 23 that partition walls, where they're movable and intended to be moved in the course of the qualifying activity, will indeed be considered plant and machinery and will therefore qualify for capital allowances. So now I'm not so sure about my answer, and what I need to do, and in an exam scenario what I would do, is I would make a note that I need to request extra information from Daniel about these partition walls. Are they fixed in place or are they movable with the intention of moving them around? If it's the latter, then they will qualify for capital allowances. Moving to item 14 here, decorative assets are included as something that will qualify for capital allowances. Well, this painting to hang in the reception area would appear to be a decorative asset. But let's read on within item 14. Decorative assets must be provided for the enjoyment of the public in a hotel, restaurant or similar trade. The idea being here is that they're designed to improve and create a nice ambience for the people who are coming to the hotel or the restaurant. But Daniel's business does not look like it's a hotel or a restaurant. We're told at the outset there he's bought some office space, so I'm assuming he's going to use it as an office, in which case, though the painting is a decorative asset, it's not a decorative asset used in the right type of trade, and therefore capital allowances won't be available because it does not meet the conditions of item 14 of list C. So again, without having that legislation there to help me, without having some familiarity of what's in the legislation and how useful it can be, I would have really struggled to have got a good pass on that part of the question. But being familiar with sections 21, 22 and 23, I can now really impress the examiner with what I know. Okay, so where are we at so far? We've looked at how to navigate our way around the legislation with a focus there on primary legislation, parts 1A to 1C. By having a go at some of these examples that I've given you, I hope you agree that the legislation can be tremendously useful with all the detailed lists that we've looked at. And I've given you some tips on how to highlight, starting with the contents pages and then perhaps using different colours as you go into the detail. What are we going to look at next? I haven't mentioned at all the orange books, or haven't mentioned them in much detail. And it's the sort of thing that often students aren't too familiar with VAT. It might be a small part of their exam, perhaps if you're doing ATT paper 2 or paper 4 or paper 3, there's a little bit of VAT on that. If you're doing awareness module VAT for CTA or some of the APS papers, you need some awareness of VAT. So the orange book, part 1, gives you everything you need to know on VAT. At the front of the book, you've got the VAT Act. It's not a particularly big act. And in particular, I want you to draw your attention to the schedules, which are right at the back of the Act. Schedule 7A, 8 and 9 give you a list of what is a reduced rate supply in Schedule 7A, what is a zero rated supply in Schedule 8, and what is an exempt supply in Schedule 9. And very often you'll see questions where you might need to check up what type of supply you're dealing with. So those schedules are extremely useful. Then within this same book, you've got not just the primary legislation, the Act itself, but also the secondary legislation. So in particular, I want to draw your attention to Statutory Instrument 1995-2518. That's got some really helpful regulations. Again, I would highlight the contents page for this statutory instrument, because it's quite a big one, as well as perhaps highlighting some of the detail in the regulations. So what you've got in there in Regulation 14 and 16 is the contents, or what must be included in a VAT invoice to make it a valid invoice. Within Regulations 49 to 60, you've got all the rules on annual accounting, flat rate scheme and cash accounting. So the rules about which types of businesses can use those different accounting schemes and how they work. And then after that, you've got the rules on partial exemption and capital goods scheme. One other bit of secondary legislation I want to draw your attention to is Notice Section 41A on international services. That's a really good place to look up some of the exceptions to the rule on international services. So I find that notice particularly helpful when I'm teaching these rules. So I've hopefully allayed your fears on VAT and explained how the Orange Book Part 1 can help you on that. Let's talk a little bit about the secondary legislation next. So what's in Part 2 of the Yellow Books? So the secondary legislation, remember I said to you, was very often written in more user-friendly, easier to understand language. And there really are some useful things in there, and I'm going to draw your attention to some of them. So there's quite a few statements of practice. I've just listed out a few there. But if, for example, you're doing a question on purchase of own shares and you want to make sure that the benefit of trade test is met, Statement of Practice 282 is a good place to look. For income tax purposes, it might be the case that the employer is providing a benefit to an employee and is agreeing to pay the tax on behalf of the employee. That's called a PAYE settlement agreement, and the rules on that are covered in Statement of Practice May 96, And that gives you lots of examples of the sorts of benefits which might be the subject of a PAYE settlement agreement. Next, you've got some revenue interpretations. Revenue Interpretation 228 looks at the meaning of a trading company. One of the conditions for business asset disposal relief and for gift relief to be available is that the company in which these shares are being disposed of must be a trading company. This revenue interpretation explains exactly what a trading company is. So again, very useful. There are some press releases within the secondary legislation. In particular, in October 18, there's a useful press release which gives a note on the new structures and building allowances. Some useful codes of practice, in particular, the compliance checks with regard to various different penalties, which gives a lot of detail about how those are applied. For anyone who is doing an exam which includes overseas aspects of income tax and or capital gains tax, RDR, residence, domicile and remittance 1, 3 and 4 are incredibly useful. They've got all the statutory residency tests in there, and in particular, for those where it's relevant, if you need to know about how to split a tax year and whether or not that's possible, it's got all the rules for all the various different cases and what conditions need to be met. So very, very useful for anyone doing perhaps ATT paper 1 or CTA advanced technical individuals paper. Also at the back of part 2, you've got the revised guidance on IR35, personal service companies. You've also got some guidelines on the meaning of research and development for tax purposes. So particularly useful if perhaps you're doing the CTA OMB paper and you need to establish whether the activity of a company is indeed qualifying as a research and development activity. And you've also got some rules on disclosure of tax avoidance scheme near the back of part 2. Some really useful information in part 2 in a language that's easy to understand. So well worth making sure you're comfortable with what's in there, what's useful to you for your exams, and bookmarking it with those index flags. So finally, let's have a think about how useful the index is. We've talked in some detail about the contents page, but what about the index? So at the back of part 1C, you've got the index, which relates to the primary legislation within parts 1A, 1B and 1C. That's in 2 parts. You've got the normal index at the beginning, and then behind that are words and phrases index. For each of the other volumes, you've got a separate index page or index section at the back of each of those volumes. Now, in all honesty, the index is not overly useful, but it can help you out sometimes. So let me give you a little example. Have a look on the left-hand side of the screen. I'm doing a question perhaps on personal service companies. I can't remember where to find it. So I think, okay, I'm just going to go to the index. I'm going to look up personal service companies and see what that throws up. And I do that, but there is nothing in the index under personal service companies. So I try again. This time I think I'm going to look up IR35. But again, nothing in the index to help me on that. So I'm persevering. Next thing I'm going to try is looking up deemed employment income. And again, that's not in the index. So what do? Well, eventually I get there. I look in the index and find intermediary. And that then directs me to the relevant bits of legislation that are going to help me on these rules. So if I know what I'm looking for, the index can be really helpful, but it's not always as intuitive as you'd like it to be. So let me sum up what we've seen so far. There are many volumes of the legislation, but I've given you, I hope, a key indication as to how you're going to find things in the various different volumes. We've seen together just a few examples of how useful the legislation can be in terms of providing you with long lists that otherwise you wouldn't have access to. I've given you some tips as to how to mark up the legislation, and here on this slide are my golden rules. Less is better than more. You can always come back and highlight a bit more later on. Before you actually start highlighting, think carefully, how much do I need to know about this topic? To what extent is it on my syllabus? How useful is it going to be to me in the exam? Always highlight the contents pages, as well as going into, if necessary, the detail within the sections. Think about highlighting things in the index, but as we've seen, it might not be that helpful. As we saw with capital allowances, perhaps think about using different colours to signpost you. And bear in mind, you can't highlight everything, and that's not the most productive use of your time in preparing for the exams. You want to make sure you're doing plenty of question practice, and that perhaps as you do questions and you think, I didn't have enough information to answer that, think about what's in the legislation, can that help me? Perhaps I'll highlight something in there for next time round. What do the examiners say? So these are the examiner's comments with regard to the CTA Advanced Technical paper. Let me just read out to you the bits I've highlighted in red. Since the focus of the paper is on technical skills, we're told their candidates will never be penalised for referring to the legislation. Well, that's good news. And then looking at the second paragraph, we're told there may be some questions where we, that being the examiners, specifically ask for an answer by reference to legislation or case law. And in such cases, candidates who do not provide such references will miss out on some marks. So what we're seeing here is not only will the examiners not penalise you for giving legislation references, in some styles of question, you might specifically be asked for it and you need to give the legislation references to maximise your marks in the exam. But a final word of warning. You're not going to get marks for just copying things out of the legislation. You still have to understand it. The legislation will give you the rules, but you've then got to apply it to the scenario that's presented to you in the questions and then give your advice based on what is included in the legislation. So it's not just about copying conditions from the legislation, it's about applying it to the scenario. Thank you very much. I hope you found this session useful. If you've got any questions, my email address is up on the screen in front of you. If you want to book another session, then please email the exam training team and the email address is up on the screen as well. Otherwise, very best of luck with your studies and very best of luck with using your legislation.